Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Fox. I'm with the consulting firm Community Strategy Partners, and I'm the moderator for this afternoon's roundtable. Building inclusive communities, is housing the key ingredient, and most importantly, innovation and opportunities. So thank you for everyone who's joined, and thank you to Move to Prosper for bringing us together for this conversation. Move to Prosper is hosting this and a series of other events that have been taking place today about building inclusive communities and expanding inclusive housing opportunities in Central Ohio. Move to Prosper is an initiative of Ohio State University's City and Regional Planning Program, along with community partners. It's an innovative program to improve life outcomes for children and their mothers by creating opportunities for residential and financial stability through temporary rental support and a comprehensive coaching program that facilitates successful moves to higher resourced communities. I also want to thank the more than 20 sponsors and partners who have joined us in creating this initiative that kicks off today and will be going forward for the next year to expand conversations about housing inclusivity and inclusive communities in Central Ohio. A few housekeeping things. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, or you can also use the raised hand feature during the Q&A. Except for the panelists, we ask that you mute your microphone so everyone can hear the discussion. So our goals for this afternoon, first of all, we want to discuss the need for and the barriers to building more variety of housing types and sizes in our region. We want to uncover innovations that we might undertake to open up both rental and home ownership opportunities. We want to hear from our panel about ways in which we can find new tools. So we have some tools that we've been using, but we want to look at new tools for creating inclusive communities because we understand that when all communities and neighborhoods are diverse and inclusive, all children will grow up with the richness of diversity and become better equipped to succeed. And our hope for today is that you will leave with action steps for broadening the discussion of housing needs and can advocate for finding new tools so that we can create inclusive communities throughout Central Ohio. So now I have the honor of introducing our national guest, Rick Kahlenberg. He is the director of K-12 Equity and a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, a 102-year-old New York and Washington, D.C. based think tank. Rick is the author or editor of 17 books and has been called the intellectual father of the economic integration movement in K-12 schooling. His more recent work has centered on how exclusionary zoning laws have made communities and schools more economically segregated and how increasing inclusive housing can make our communities better. Rick's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The American Prospect, and he's also written a report about the success of Move to Prosper. And we're putting a link to that report in the chat if you would like to capture that link and take a look at that report later. So Rick, please tell us more about your work and how you came to learn about Central Ohio's housing challenges.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy, and great to be with you all. As Kathy mentioned, I started for years studying on the issues of education, and that has led me to housing. One of the best things we can do for students is to give them a chance to attend economically and racially integrated schools. It's been shown to be even more effective than putting additional resources into high poverty schools. And I've been led to housing because most people like neighborhood public schools. 2/3 of American children attend those neighborhood schools, and people like those environments for their kids. They like them to be close by. And so if we want to integrate schools, we have to integrate housing and provide more opportunity to make residential areas inclusive. There's also a big additional benefit to children of living in economically and racially integrated communities. Apart from the school, there was one study that looked at the benefit of children who had the opportunity to live in mixed income neighborhoods and schools, neighborhoods and attend mixed income schools. And it found that about 2/3 of the benefit came from the school environment and 1/3 from the housing environment. So trying to integrate schools by themselves is a good thing, but integrating housing is even better. And so that's why I've focused on housing in more recent years. I've been drawn to Columbus, Kathy, for a couple of reasons. One is the problems here in Columbus are particularly challenging. So some of you may know that in a study back in 2015, Columbus was found to be the second most economically segregated metropolitan area in the country among big cities. There was only one place, Austin, Texas, that was more highly segregated. So that's a challenge. A related challenge is that in Columbus, if you are born into a low-income family, you're very unlikely, more unlikely than in most other cities, to eventually make it to the middle class. So Raj Chetty at Harvard University looked at 50 metropolitan areas and ranked Columbus 45th out of 50 in terms of social mobility. So there are some challenges that are particularly tough. And I know we have a few slides to talk about how Columbus got into this situation. So maybe Rachel, if we could share those slides at this point, that would be great. Thanks. And I know slides can be overwhelming sometimes on Zoom. So let me just say there are only 2 slides I'm going to show, although I cheated because each of the slides has 2 pictures in it. So the first slide looks at the famous redlining maps that existed for communities throughout the country and in Columbus. So this is from 1936. Many of you know about the concept of redlining, that the federal government was interested in ensuring that more people could be homeowners. So they said, we're going to subsidize people who want to own a home by insuring the mortgages. And the caveat was that they would only insure mortgages in certain neighborhoods. And so you can see here in Columbus and the surrounding area, there are areas marked in green and blue that were considered safe by the federal government to insure, and so they would invest in those. And then the areas that are designated in red, delineated in red, are the so-called redlined communities. Those were the communities that the federal government, they looked at the racial makeup and the economic makeup of the people in the community, said because African Americans and low-income families are disproportionately lived in these areas, they were going to be redlined so that they're not going to be invested in. So that was the first step. In 1968, redlining was outlawed, thankfully, but we still have lots of ways in which the government promotes segregation. The second slide shows the zoning maps for the Columbus area and Franklin County today. And I'm sorry, we could go back. I'm just on the second map, which delineates between those areas where you can build lots of different types of housing, multifamily housing or single family homes if you want. Those are the green areas. The blue areas, they say we only will allow one type of housing. If you have a single family home, you can use your land to develop that. But if you want a duplex, a triplex, or a modest sized apartment building, it's illegal to build any of those things in these areas. So it's often referred to as snob zoning because the intent in many cases is to keep out low-income families, working class families who might not be able to afford a single family home. Okay, now if we go to the next slide, please, Rachel. Thanks. The Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University has designated areas that it considers high opportunity. Those are the ones in dark red, and those that are lower opportunity, those that are designated in the lighter colors, the whitish and the yellow colors. The Kirwan Institute said high opportunity neighborhoods are those where the schools are high performing, where there's good access to jobs, where there are lots of desirable amenities that virtually any family would like for themselves and their children. You'll notice that there's an overlap between those areas that are exclusive and fence out working class people by saying only single family homes are allowed, and those that are tend to provide higher opportunities. So what that means is working class people are shut out from many of these higher opportunity neighborhoods. There's also a powerful racial impact. So we're circling all the way back to redlining. The final map shows where Black people disproportionately live in Franklin County. And you can see the dark red are the areas where there are high concentrations of African Americans, and then the lighter colors, lower concentrations. And the tragic thing here is history is just perpetuating itself, and the areas that Black people live in tend to be those with the lowest levels of opportunity. So thank you for those slides. The good news is that the other reason I was attracted to Columbus was I heard about the Moving to Opportunity, Move to Prosper program, which allows, as Kathy suggested, a modest number of single mothers and their families with young children to move to those higher opportunity regions. I think it's a wonderful program that increases social mobility by providing opportunities for these families. It also increases social cohesion because a program that introduces greater diversity into some of these mostly exclusive communities, economically and racially exclusive communities, is a benefit also to those middle and upper middle class families who will now have as neighbors people who have had different life experiences and may bring, because of those different experiences, different perspectives and interesting ways of viewing the world, novel ways of viewing of the world that are different than the kind of the traditional upper middle class experience. And we know from lots of research that that's good for kids. It's good for adults. as well. Final thing I'll say is that Moving to Move to Prosper is a wonderful program for catapulting families and children over these walls zoning walls that we tend to ignore in our public policy. But at the same time, I hope we'll get into a discussion of dealing with some of those systemic barriers that that create those walls in the first place, and could serve as a nice supplement to what Move to Prosper is doing.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. So let me mention also that the maps that Rick was talking about, as well as two other sets of maps, one from the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission and another from Professor Jason Reese from Ohio State University, plus the maps Rick talked about, are all available online, and the links to those are in the chat if you'd like to copy those out, if you'd like to look through those maps. And I want to mention especially that the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission maps have some excellent explanation with each of the maps. So they're very, very helpful if you are trying to understand these issues in more detail. And then I'd also, now that we have our, we're about to start our panel, and I'd like to pull up the agenda well, first of all, our sponsors. We have more than 20 organizations that have joined as sponsors and partners. We want to thank all of them. Also, Rachel, if you can pull up the agenda real quickly. We've just heard from Rick, and we're going to have a panel discussion next. Then we'll take questions from the audience, and you're welcome to put questions in the chat, or when we get to that point, do your raise hand function. And then we want to wrap up with some recommendations about next steps from our panel so that you all have concrete ideas to take away from today's conversation. So now I'd like to introduce the panel, and I'm thrilled to say that we have a very exciting panel that's a combination of people who work in the field of planning and housing. I'm told the technical term for that is housing nerds. And then we also have several people from communities in Central Ohio where there are grassroots efforts to look at how we're developing our communities and how we might change their trajectory in the future. So to start off, Carlie Boos and Carlie, if you want to raise your hand, thank you, is the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, where she provides leadership and strategic direction to expand affordable housing resources. Previously, she was Community and Economic Development Counsel at the Legal Aid Society of Columbus, and Carlie has extensive experience in policy and program development from her work at the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. Carlie holds a bachelor's degree in women's studies and political science from OSU and a law degree from Case Western Reserve University. And she's the president of the board for the Franklinton Development Association. And she tells me that she unwinds at night by baking cakes, which I want some of, and chilling with her husband and chasing around their endlessly energetic kid, Easy, which sounds like a good balance, cake and then running around. Next, we have James Chaffin. James, could you raise your hand? Great, thank you. James is the vice chair of WeRISE for Greater Westerville, which is a grassroots organization launched in 2021 to eradicate racism and promote social justice. James currently works professionally as a supervisor at a healthcare navigation company, but he also has professional experience with affordable housing, having previously served in many roles with Habitat for Humanity International. He's a graduate of Franklin University and Central Michigan University. James and his wife are raising 2 daughters in Westerville City Schools and are actively involved in their local church. And following James, we have Matt Gregory. Matt, thank you very much. Matt is Senior Vice President at NAI Ohio Equities and is also president of the nonprofit Building Worthington's Future. And that organization is a nonprofit focused on respecting Worthington's heritage, improving quality of life, while also ensuring the city's future economic vitality. They advocate for economic and social well-being, and they believe that successful communities are diverse, accessible, and work to create a strong sense of belonging for all residents. In his day job over the past 15 years, Matt has completed more than 800 real estate transactions totaling $500 million in volume and 7.3 million square feet. Matt's active with local real estate organizations, and he has served as the chair of the commercial section of the Columbus Realtors and some other real estate organizations. He's an OSU grad, lives in Worthington with his wife and 3 kids, where he volunteers on a number of community efforts. So welcome, Matt. And then our 4th panelist is Kerstin Carr. She is the Director of Planning and Sustainability at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. And Kerstin, if you've raised your hand, I may have missed it. And thank you for those maps from your team. Kerstin and her team address active transportation, the natural and built environment, transportation safety, and energy for communities in Central Ohio. She has nearly 20 years of experience in urban planning and transportation. She currently chairs the Scenario Planning Consortium of the National Association of Regional Councils. So in other words, MORPC's counterpart throughout the country. And she serves on the Neighborhood Design Center board and is an advisory member to the OSU Center for Real Estate and of the Early Childhood Advisory Council. Kerstin is a 2019 grad of Leadership Columbus and was part of the 2020 Future 50 class. She has a doctoral degree in geography from the University of Regensburg, Germany. So welcome to Kerstin. So now that you've met our panelists, let's hear from them about housing in our communities in Central Ohio. So I'd like to start with a question to Kerstin, but once we have her thoughts on this, any of the other panelists who would like to join in, please feel free to do so. So Kerstin, according to Michael Wilkos, the Senior Vice President at United Way of Central Ohio, in his review of the 2020 census, the city of Columbus just experienced its largest numeric population increase in history, a 15% growth rate for the decade, and the fastest the city has grown since the 1950s. In addition, Franklin County grew by almost 14%, with the 2nd largest numeric increase for Franklin County since the 1950s. So your team at MORPC led the creation of the Regional Housing Strategy for Central Ohio. Tell us about the main takeaways and how the region can accommodate this kind of growth.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here with my fellow panelists, and I'm glad you gave us a shout out for the data as well. The census information is actually out now too. And so not to toot our own horn, but our data team did an amazing job forecasting what would happen in the last 10 years, and they were off by 1%. like 2,000 people, which is pretty impressive. We grew by about 250,000 in the last 2 years. And yes, we're on track to become a region of 3 million, pending that this pandemic will slow down and get us back to normal at some point. And yes, we led the regional housing strategy. It was completed last year. And as part of this effort, we did an extensive review of existing research and new data sources to really better understand our region's housing situation when it comes to building more housing, more affordable housing, and also the right housing mix. And we had a more than 100 member advisory board that represented at least 50 different organizations, from developers to nonprofits and the local governments. And with that advisory board, we identified over 100 action items that could be undertaken to help create more access to homes and also to help with building more housing in general, which is something that we'll certainly touch on more later on. And so out of these action items, we prioritized 5 that we wanted to see if we can get them done in the short term. And those included reducing regulatory barriers or red tape to get more homes built, passing source of income protection legislations, creating a housing market for innovation, advocating for more housing incentives, including rental assistance, and then working together with our partners across the state towards a state housing tax credit to help with gap financing. We're going to work over the next few months to evaluate where we are with these action items to really figure out what our next step is going to be moving forward. But I would say, if nothing else, the past year and a half has really shown us that we have our work cut out. And I know we'll dive deeper into some of these issues we're facing as well.
Great. Thank you, Kerstin. Any thoughts from the panel on these 5 priorities that Kerstin has outlined, or anything else about the housing strategy that the region has put together through MORPC's leadership?
So I think the housing strategy is wonderful. There are so many actionable items in there and things that, if you're a jurisdiction and you want to do good, but you don't know where to start, it is a very usable tool. But what I actually wanted to comment on is when Kerstin said that her team was only 1% off, that should be terrifying to everybody. Great work, right? But they're projecting that we're going to have 1 million more residents in our region in the coming years. And that to meet that increased demand, we need to be building 14,000 homes a year. And we're not building anywhere close to that. We're building about half of that. So if you think the housing crisis is bad now, if Kerstin and her team end up being right, what we are looking towards in the coming decade should terrify everybody. So I don't know why I decided to start with doom and gloom. It's right where I went, though.
Thank you, Carlie. So what you're saying is that you didn't like what Kerstin's team put together and their numbers, but we better wake up and listen.
Yes, that's a much rosier way.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So wake up and smell the coffee at 4 p.m. Okay. So next I'd like to pitch a question to Carlie. And this, I'm going to pull a little bit more from the census data to frame this question. Carlie, your Alliance's member organizations are competing for properties to create affordable housing, and I understand it's getting harder. According to the census analysis that Michael Wilco shared, Greater Northland, for example, had a 15% growth in population, but only a 1.1% increase in housing units, while the number of vacant units fell by 47.8%. And Greater Linden saw a population increase of 7.3%, which was a reversal of several decades-long trend in that area. The number of housing units fell by 3.7%, and vacant housing units fell by almost 40%. So these are just 2 neighborhood examples of a big change in properties. There are not as many properties that are available for rehab or improvement. And Michael's observation is that in many ways, Franklin County was able to accommodate some of the growth because of converting vacant properties back into usable housing. But if our growth continues and the vacant housing stock is less, how does this impact the organizations that your alliance is trying to assist in creating more affordable housing? And well, let's start there, but really we want to know, how do we balance sort of, there's a desire to improve some neighborhoods that need it, and we're doing some of that. But we also have to look at the whole region. So I'll pitch all of that to you.
Yes, thank you. And I should kind of say at the outset who our membership is, because I think it kind of helps inform how we approach these issues. At the Alliance, we're a 25 member group, and our commitment to the community is that we want to cut the affordable housing cost burden gap in half in what is now 7 remaining years. So we had a 10-year goal of doing that. And before the pandemic, we had been on track. We had been creating new programming. We had been raising additional investment sources. We had been building housing. That was a goal that was certainly within reach, but we created that plan by really looking at the housing landscape through our members' lens. And we are really intentional about diversifying our membership, not just racially and equity and from kind of a representation standpoint, but from different industry perspectives as well. So we have developers and owners and operators who are trying to compete to buy land so that they can put permanently affordable housing on it. But we also have the investors who see that same opportunity through a different lens. We have homeless shelter operators and homeless shelter system managers who see it from a different perspective, housing counselors, home owners. There's a lot to untangle there, right? There's a lot who come at this from a different perspective. I think that the question kind of boiled down to a little bit of a both and sort of dynamic, right? That we need to make sure that in the near term, people have the ability to exercise housing choice. If you want to stay in your neighborhood, you should be able to find an affordable home there that meets your family's needs. If you want to move to a different neighborhood, you should be able to find an affordable home there that meets your family's needs. And that's kind of the individual approach versus a place-based approach. And there's a place for all of that. And finding the right balance can be contentious, but it's a worthwhile conversation to have. Let me know where I can go deeper. I think this is a fantastically interesting conversation, but I will say that before the pandemic, the reason that the Alliance was created, there were 54,000 Franklin County households that paid more than half of their income towards housing, 54,000. And if you're paying more than 30%, your cost burden, that's a danger zone. If you're paying more than 50%, that's a life and death zone. That's where you're choosing between your insulin and your rent every month. They're between cooking your kids a healthy meal and helping them with their homework, or pulling another shift to pay the mortgage. And we had 54,000 who were in that range. The reason I bring that up now is we need solutions across all of the board, because that is no longer silver bullet territory. We need the place-based, we need the mobility-based, we need all of it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carlie. Thoughts from other panelists about what Carlie has shared with us?
This is James. I just wanted to jump in real quick. I agree with you, Carlie. There's an all hands on deck sort of approach. The pandemic just exposed a lot of the, shall we say, the sores that were painful already for families that were cost burdened, that were working 1.5 jobs, trying to raise a family, trying to keep the family together as a unit, helping kids with homework. Maybe you've got a parent that you've taken in, you're trying to take care of them as well. Just made it more, we'll just say more stressful, for those families. They're trying to hold on. It brings to mind a shift that we made, or a pivot, more likely, the habitat many years ago, when we began to stop focusing on building a number of units, trying to build our way out of poverty housing, and started looking at revitalizing neighborhoods and helping them become more focused on achieving whatever they aspire the neighborhood to be, and supporting them along the way, rather than giving a prescription through more units. But but I totally agree with you. There's so many things that need to be considered in terms of feasibility, and they're all hard. But they all require the investment and time and energy from not just communities and government and all that, but also from the residents themselves, so they can be more attached to place if they want to stay there, or if they aspire to, let's say they're getting older and they want to move to another place because they're in a different stage of life, they should be able to have that ability to do that. So.
All right. Thank you.
And
yes,
Kathy,
ahead,
if I may, thank you. If I may add a couple more data points to it as well, because through the regional housing strategy, and granted that information is probably 2 years old now already, so it might be worse now than it was, but we had back then for the region, saw over 200,000 households being cost burdened, paying 30% or more of the income on housing. Half of that were actually higher than that. And as Carlie mentioned, when you are housing cost burdened, you're making decisions on what you're going to pay first, your rent or other important things to take care of. And so it's really easy to slip into being behind on paying your rent and then getting evicted. And so our eviction rate is actually twice as high as the national average on top of that as well. And we know that that was a huge issue as the pandemic hit and a lot of people lost their jobs. And so it's certainly a really, really big concern here locally. The other part that I wanted to mention is that in addition to that, and because the housing market is being so hot, we also need to think about the missing middle housing. And as part of our research, one of the things we found out is that the middle class is currently being squeezed on both ends. So with our housing market being so tight and people being more aware of how much they can spend or where they want to spend their money and not wanting to be housing cost burden, our higher income folks are purchasing homes below what they could afford, and our lower income folks are forced to buy up because there simply isn't enough affordable housing stock there. And so again, it's really important how we can work together to create that diversity of our housing stock and to create more affordability in general.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kerstin.
Kathy, can I jump in really quick?
Yes, please do, Rick.
Carlie, the way you put it in terms of choosing between insulin and making rent is really highlights the tragedy here. And I want to kind of tie this issue back to the exclusionary zoning that I mentioned before, because not only does it block opportunity, it artificially drives up the price of housing in a whole metropolitan region. So when you have a certain amount of land and you say you can only build a single family home, sometimes with a minimum lot size, you're constraining the supply of housing in the region. And just as OPEC decreases supply in order to increase prices, that's what exclusionary zoning does. And I'm also supportive of all the programs, Carlie, that you're championing to provide government support of affordable housing. But it's just, the New York Times put it this way. They said, these exclusionary zoning policies are actually one of the rare cases where government is the problem. The famous line from Ronald Reagan. This is government creating artificial scarcity by fiat and making the affordable housing crisis so much worse than it should be.
Thank you, Rick. And that leads into the next question I'd like to pose to our panel. So what's the role of mixed income housing, both rental and home ownership in community success? How does the shortage of housing and the economic and racial segregation in housing impact everybody in the region? So, thoughts on this?
So I think if you like, I can kind of set a little bit of a data landscape tone on what that shortage looks like. I mean, I think the 54,000 number is a starting point, right? It's influential. It's a canary in the coal mine, but there's depth to that. At the very least, I'll note that the cost burden rate for white households and Black households has about a 12 percentage point gap in Franklin County alone. within a single county, you're seeing 55 to 43% of households who are housing cost burden based on their race alone. We see that there is cost burdened at every income threshold, that there is not enough housing for anybody in Franklin County, but without any hesitation, that hits lower income households harder. For every 100 families that need an affordable home in Franklin County, there's only 32 houses for them. That short is extreme. And that's not just households who are, pensioners and who are fixed income and who are youth and children who can't work. But to be a worker right now, you need to earn almost $20 an hour just to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment, just a plain old, plain Jane apartment anywhere in Franklin County. And in Ohio, only one of our 10 most common jobs pays anywhere near that range. So it is a working problem. It is a dependency problem. We know that this is getting worse. That from 2017 to 2019, we lost about 20,000 homes that rented for under $900 a month. That, for context, that's the same as wiping the city of Reynoldsburg off of the map. We lost the city of Reynoldsburg in affordability in the last 2 years alone. And that's on the back of these million people who are heading into our region where we are not building to meet that need. So that is the landscape that I think about when I start to process solutions. I think that there's a lot of things we've talked about with regard to inclusivity that are incredibly cost effective, that are tried and true, and that in many regards, Ohio is well behind the pitch on. Source of income ordinances is one of the first that comes to mind. It doesn't solve the affordability problem, except it kind of does. If you want me to get super weedy, I can talk about how doubling subsidies because private sector landlords don't accept vouchers overburdens our tax credit program, but you got to really want to talk about 9% LIHTC to enjoy that conversation.
Okay, well, Carlie, we'll assume that that's a conversation for another day. But thank you for those excellent points. And I'd like to hear from other panelists. As we know we have to build more housing, we're hearing that. As we build that more housing, what are your thoughts about the importance of creating that new housing in a way that accommodates mixed income communities, mixed income neighborhoods? Let's talk a little bit about, so we have this challenge. Our opportunity is we have to build more housing. Why should we do it as mixed income rather than the kind of individual enclaves we've been having of people with more means in one place and people with less means in a different place?
I mean, I think it's critically important that we think about mixed income housing. And I would think that Rick probably has a lot more best practices or examples across the country from his research, but there's so much evidence out there, not even within the United States, but internationally, how mixed income communities work well to help people move up. Locally, we have Vineland Park is probably one of the best examples currently. And I came from Germany and I grew up in a mixed income community. I don't think I realized it until I was older, but we lived in an apartment building. My mom still lives there, surrounded by people in single family homes and homeowners. But it was a very mixed, it was not just a mixed income community, but also mixed use, and everything was in walking distance. I never felt different than anybody else or any of my friends where the parents had more money. And so it's like, if you do it right, it just becomes a way of life and it makes you feel that you belong, which I think is something that is really, really important. When we think about building mixed income communities or housing here, I want to say the biggest inhibitors, and Rick touched on it already, is one, our zoning codes that just don't support it, that support exclusionary housing, and then also our residents' attitudes. And I'm sure we're going to talk about NIMBYism at some point during this conversation. And just another side story, I just came back from Sedona, Arizona, and as we were driving towards the Phoenix airport, we stopped at this little suburb called Anthem. I don't know if anyone is here that knows the Phoenix area, but it was exclusionary zoning to the nth degree, with every neighborhood being gated and walled off. It was extremely well taken care of and clean, but it felt not inviting by any means. And diversity is just so important to allow us to learn and to grow from each other. It's always a two-way street. And yeah, I'm a big proponent, and I believe that building these mixed income communities will honestly also help with other societal issues than just housing.
Great. Thank you, Kerstin. Any other thoughts on this? The importance of integrating mixed incomes as we build new housing in our neighborhoods and communities.
Just to add that, not only is mixed income, morally and economically the right answer, but it's what consumers are demanding. It is what especially millennial and Gen Z consumers want to see in their housing. And they are leaving behind those style communities that are refusing to get with the times. So it is a tax-based imperative for cities to begin considering how they retain residents.
Great, thank you, Carlie. And that goes to the competitiveness of our region, that we're not pricing out people and we're not failing to deliver housing in a way that the younger generations are interested in seeing it. So I'd like to turn now to James and Matt, our two representatives from community organizations created by residents. What inspired each of you to become involved in the grassroots organizations that you are involved in creating? What about your communities do you love? And what do you think needs to change that inspired you to create these organizations that would make your communities more inclusive? So let's start with Matt, because we haven't heard from him yet.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate everyone having me today. So building Worthington's future started by a group of probably a dozen or so individuals about 4 years ago. And some of the attributes, things that we talk about, first of all, there are many attributes that make Worthington attractive. And everyone that lives there kind of knows it. And unfortunately, it's only enjoyed by a very limited amount of people. We're one of the smallest suburbs from a population standpoint. And we want to have our community be able to be enjoyed by a larger amount of people. Professionally, I work in communities all around Central Ohio, so I get to see what other communities are doing and what other city governments are doing, and I see some of the creative and progressive ideas to solve some of the issues we're talking about today. And I really just had a passion to bring some of those ideas to the community where I live. And what I have heard in the 10 years or so I've lived in Worthington is that there's really only been a voice of a vocal minority. And the goal of our organization is to try to provide an alternate perspective that may not, it's not used to being heard. You asked what some of these attributes are of our city that I enjoy, and I know many people do. First of all, not our entire city, but parts of our city are very walkable. In our old Worthington district, we have, unfortunately, not as much density as what some of us would like, but those that live close to Old Worthington enjoy that walkability that I know a lot of people, find it or strive for. The other thing is we're one of the more, I would argue, one of the more centrally located communities in Central Ohio. We sit right at 270 and 23, and you can get anywhere in the city, including downtown, in a very short amount of time. So that's another thing. And then, I think what a lot of people know us for is the historic nature, historic charm. And while our organization does want to preserve that, we also understand that we don't want to get stuck in the past. There's a way to maintain that historic charm, but also, allow new development, kind of a good hybrid of the two. And then just some ideas that I've been brainstorming here on what we can do to achieve this inclusive community that we're talking about. That I know that a lot of people don't like this word in our community, but I think we need increased density. Density has become a bad word. I know we've talked to, at least in Worthington, and we need to change that narrative. How can we do that? By expanding the variety of housing stock. I think everyone has been talking about that. We just got done talking about mixed income. We need housing stock of many different types. We need more for entry level families, for recent graduates. And then we also need, on the other side of the spectrum, we need for empty nesters and, those that need to maybe downsize. And that would free up shadow vacancy of what all the existing stock that we have right now. I think we need to allow ideas from outside developers. I've seen this reoccurring theme that unless it's a Worthington-born idea, that it's not a good idea. And I think we need to listen to those on the outside that are definitely more innovative than us. I think we need to loosen up and have less exclusionary zoning. I think it's what everyone's been saying on this panel. And then last but not least, and I know that this is easier said than done, but I truly believe that our leadership needs to be willing to make decisions that are unpopular. Sometimes, leadership's in that position for a reason. And even though some of the constituents on the surface might not like some of the choices, if it's for the greater good, and for all the reasons we've been talking about on this call, I think we need to be willing to do that.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So James, tell us about Westerville and your organization, WeRISE for Greater Westerville, and what inspired you to be one of the leaders with other residents in the Westerville area who want to see a change in how the community develops going forward.
Thanks, Kathy. So Westerville has many elements that are similar to Worthington: walkability, different types of community events to bring the community together. We have Fourth Fridays. If you're passing through on State Street on a Friday or trying to it's usually during the summertime. You'll run into that traffic and things. So it's picturesque in many different ways. And one of the things that most people enjoy about Westerville is the huge investment the city has made into parks and recs, just spaces for families and communities and friends to come together. That's wonderful. It's growing. It's growing by leaps and bounds, it seems. There's been a lot of investment over the years, definitely the last several years, within the Westerville community. But one thing that we've never had was a organization that was dedicated specifically to anti-discrimination, anti-racism, and social justice. Never, ever had it. And so I was invited to be a part of our launch team last fall. This was a group of some people who work professionally in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and then others who work for the school district, and then some people who just cared, concerned citizens that wanted Westerville to be committed to having what Martin Luther King Jr. called a beloved community. We wanted to have that, and we knew we didn't have that. On the surface, very pretty parks and walkable uptown and all of that things, but we knew that something beneath the surface was not there. And so I joined the launch team. We started the organization this year, and so we're very young. And I think probably a month into our starting WeRISE for Greater Westerville, I sit in my car one day and I began to think to myself, I don't know why I came to. I began to think about just suburbs in general and how they were not created with someone who looked like me in mind. Okay, and having read various books and educated myself beyond the minimal teaching that I got on Black history and other parts of our history that we don't like to talk about and things, I began to realize, wait a minute, that's where I live at. I live in a suburb that originally was not designed for me or my family. And so anyway, WeRISE for Greater Westerville is committed to eradicating individual and systemic racism. So from the smallest microaggressions that happen in our schools, and they do happen, to the most egregious forms of racism and discrimination. So it's tough work. Our board is definitely committed, and we're in the strategic planning process right now. We're into that work right now. And so housing is just one of the many pillars that we'll be talking about and then embedding into our strategic plan for the next 3 to 5 years. But one of the reasons why housing is so important is because, at least for myself, the place where you come together as family and you celebrate birthdays and you celebrate retirements and things like that is incredibly important. That's sentimental value. The place where you live, the place where you wave to your neighbor, you say good morning to, or you have a cup of coffee with, it's incredibly important. And so when I couple what I'm doing now with what I've done in the habitat space, such as aging in place and revitalization efforts across the country, I realized that for advocacy to work, you really have to put it all on the table. You really have to think about everything that's being affected. It's not just education; it's also housing. It's also other areas of life where they're impacted and that have not been really addressed. And again, so having said all that, I wanted to just quickly, Kathy, if I could, just to answer the question you asked earlier about mixed income. It works, and I've seen it work. I've seen it work in the Philadelphia suburbs. I've seen it work in Lexington, Kentucky. I've seen it work in other parts of the country. And what it does is if it's planned correctly, and if the planning involves the people who live there and want to have roots there and want their kids to have roots there, then they get to enjoy the benefits. It's not just the people who move in after everything is built up and you get Starbucks. It's the people who've lived there for 10, 12, 13, 14 years, maybe a generation or more. And so they get access to various opportunities. There's transportation, there's access to jobs, there's access to primary health care. There's all those different amenities that we enjoy in the burbs is afforded to them. And so it can work, but something we talked about earlier, it does require an appetite for that interconnectedness. And some communities are not ready. And so part of our job as an advocacy organization is to facilitate some of those crucial conversations about NIMBY, okay, and to talk about the importance of having mixed income and diversified communities, diversified in terms of race and ethnicity and things, but also economic diversity as well.
Great. James, thank you. That leads right in actually to our next segment for Q&A, and we have some questions in the chat. People are welcome to add to those as well. And I'm going to take one of the questions in the chat is hearing more discussion about overcoming neighborhood resistance. So James, you talked about that a little bit, and that being part of the role of your organization, WeRISE for Greater Westerville. I know, Matt, in Worthington, the city just undertook a visioning exercise, and part of that vision that the community has adopted is to create conditions that increase the diversity of the city to better reflect the racial and ethnic composition of the region, and create opportunities and remove barriers for people from a wide range of ages, abilities, and income levels to live in your community. So how do we reconcile these affirmative statements about people saying they want diversity, they want to support diversity, they want to welcome people of all backgrounds to their communities, with there's also the not in my backyard? How do we address that? Any panel members who would like to offer some ideas about dealing with that challenge?
I think I can start. But I mean, this is the big question of the day. NIMBYism is so hard to combat because it happens at a very emotional level, with this great fear of change and not wanting things to be different, especially if it happens right next to where I live. And then there's so much misinformation out there too when it comes to multifamily or rental or subsidized housing. And so I think there's a few things we can do, and I know they are being tried but one is keep showing the success stories of where inclusive mixed-in communities thrive is one of them, bringing people in there. There's so many folks, when you ask them where they like to vacation, it's not in an exclusionary suburban community. It's in an urban place where people thrive and mix. And so figuring out how to make them understand that concept of the design that's being proposed. The other thing is, while most people are scared of change, people often trust the people they know. And so in Reynoldsburg, I'm being a resident of Reynoldsburg, I know Carlie is too, but one thing that I've noticed is that the mayor and its administration are being really transparent and open about new development that's coming in. They're meeting with residents on a regular basis. They have a weekly podcast. And so they've been able to build a support network of regular residents who actually come out to their defense on social media. And once neighbors hear from it, from their neighbors and friends, it becomes much less scary. And I think the last thing I would want to mention is multifamily housing. It looked so different 30 years ago in many of our suburbs. It was pushed to the edges. And so I think our our development community now is often doing a beautiful job incorporating amenities into their developments so that all residents can enjoy them, such as trails and green space, lower retail and restaurant space. And so I think it's really important to make clear that while you might be building this multifamily or subsidized housing space, the development community is also adding and connecting so that you can benefit from it as well.
Thank you, Kerstin. Other panelists. Rick, it looks like you have something to offer.
Yeah, I think I want to double down on everything Kerstin said, because that's very, very powerful. I think there are kind of two sides to the equation. I mean, there's shaming and also talking about the benefits to all people. So most people don't fully realize the extent to which these arcane zoning laws are effectively keeping people out. At the luncheon today, I talked about Ruby Bridges, who is the young 6-year-old African-American girl in New Orleans, who was who was met with white mobs shouting at her in 1960, "Stay out, we don't want you because of the color of your skin." There was threats from people to poison her. Some of you may know her story. It was Norman Rockwell did the painting about her being escorted by FBI agents. Everyone understands that that's wrong today, or at least most people of goodwill understand that that's wrong. People don't fully understand that the zoning laws that are put in place have created these walls that we don't see, but have the same effect on low-income kids, disproportionately kids of color who are kept out of community. So I think educating people about kind of the nefarious history of these exclusionary zoning laws and the reality that the burden that they impose on people. The flip side is the sugar, the benefit to everyone from having a more diverse neighborhood. And some people, give lip service to this, but I think there are ways to explain it to people in exclusive communities that they can understand. As I mentioned earlier, that their kids are missing out as part of their education. They're not fully educated when they're in these homogenous enclaves. And certainly their kids are going to be entering a workforce that is very, very diverse. And they are going to need skills to know how to navigate in this new environment. And so they are missing skills. They're missing out on learning if the community is not diverse. And that applies to adults too, because we're all continuing to learn, and we just have blind spots when we're not in diverse communities. The last thing I'll say is just to give you kind of some tactical examples of from some successful communities. I mentioned that there have been reform in places like Charlotte and Minneapolis. There was a wonderful group in Minneapolis called Neighbors for More Neighbors that was able to elevate the voices of people who are excluded, so that everyone could have a better understanding of the real world impact of exclusionary zoning. So there's been research that says, the people who show up at the meetings, and I think, Matt, you were referencing in Worthington, it's disproportionately it's the negative folks who show up, and a minority sometimes who are so loud. Well, in Minneapolis, they got people who wanted a better life for their kids, just like everyone else, to show up at meetings and participate. People who are often excluded from the political process, and to elevate their voices. And one of the things I tried to do personally in writing about Move to Prosper was to talk about individual mothers who are hurt by exclusionary zoning and only had better opportunities because of this special program, Move to Prosper. And when we put names and faces to the harm that's being caused, I think people may be more likely to respond. And I'll close with just this one story about Chiara Cornelius, who I wrote about and did benefit from the Move to Prosper program. But she was in this community in South Columbus where she didn't feel like it was safe to have her kids walk a couple of blocks to their grandmother's house because of the violence in the neighborhood. And when I got to know her and to hear her story, she's someone who everyone could relate to. She is a very hardworking individual who wants better for her kids. And I think when people connect the dots and realize, wait, our community isn't allowing low-wage workers into our environment, that maybe some people will be moved to change.
Great, thank you, Rick. Really important. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from any of the panelists, all of the panelists, about we have these two desires we're hearing about, and it's just been noted in the chat that Columbus has a Neighbors for More Neighbors group. It's fairly recent, but they have been showing up at some of the zoning hearings in some of the areas where there are projects being proposed. So there's groups like Neighbors for More Neighbors, there's James and Matt's groups that are in their individual communities. And there are still people who understand that these invisible walls have been erected, and they're okay with that because they don't want people who are not like them in their community. It sounds like they're not the majority, perhaps. So how do we foster that dialogue to make sure that so that we really can advance this and not have sort of the negative voices? What do we say to those folks?
So I think that class exists, right? There are, without a doubt, some people who are opposed to integration because they are racists. You'll find lots of them in chat boxes, right? They don't come to public meetings as much as they like the internet. But I don't think that's anywhere near a majority. I don't think it is a significant portion of the people that we encounter. What I see is an entire economic system that is so fragile that everybody's home is their nest egg. I can tell you, my home is how I'm putting my kid through college, is the equity that I'm building right now that is going to make sure he can go to Ohio State, OH, go Bucks. It is also how I'm probably going to need to finance my retirement. And that's just, I think, the dynamic that a lot of millennials are looking at, and those in the Gen X, Gen Z as well. With that, there is zero risk tolerance. There's zero risk tolerance. New development next door might be wonderful. It might triple my investment. It might make my home worth more than anything ever. But there is a minuscule chance that I will lose $1 of equity, and that's my kid's college, and I can't do that. I can't risk it. You need to be able to approach that conversation, I think, in all of the ways Kerstin and Richard just lined up. I think all of those are incredibly constructive, but I also think that more people need to start understanding that the failure to act has consequences for those same priorities that are so much more significant, right? Because housing is so exclusive in some of these communities that we can no longer bring teachers in who are qualified, and the quality of our education is beginning to suffer because teachers can't afford to live here. Good ones can't come to our towns anymore. We are seeing businesses, and the Alliance just put out a survey to our members who see housing both from a housing professional lens, but also as major national brand employers with hundreds and thousands of staff members in some cases. And we said, what is the housing shortage here in Central Ohio doing for your bottom line? And 80% of them said, we are seeing reduced productivity. We are seeing reduced employee morale because folks are coming into work worried about how they are going to pay rent and worried about whether or not they're going to be evicted. That was 80%. And then another 50% said, and I'm seeing higher turnover because of that. And I'm seeing higher turnover costs because of that. From an economic development perspective, you can only sustain that for so long before people start saying, I'm not bringing my business here. I am not going to create new enterprise here. I am not going to pay Seattle wages in Columbus, Ohio. So what happens when your NIMBY eliminates your job, right? What happens when these businesses leave Columbus because it is no longer hospitable for them to stay? What happens when the housing scarcity that we've artificially created leads to property taxes that push fixed income people out the door? Where that nest egg that you thought was your safe, was your bank, is now draining your retirement savings. All of these are the path that we are on. These are inevitable in our future if we don't do something about it now. And I know I'm very doom and gloomy today, but sometimes seeing that there is a scarier thing around the corner is what you need to know. Because if you're making these decisions in a vacuum and you only say, okay, well, there's status quo or there's something that might be better, maybe if you're willing to risk it, that's not a full informed decision. People also need to see what the consequences of failing to act are.
Great. Thank you, Carlie. Wow, that was great. We have lots of comments in the chat. I hope everyone can read them. And some of the comments are that some of the questions have been answered by the recent dialogue here. I want to make sure that we have time to get to some recommendations for next steps from our panelists. So I'm going to round out our Q&A for the moment to move to next steps. And I want to just ask one more question of the panel before we move to next steps. And this has to do with the idea that some people are fearful about their property values being reduced by having rental housing or mixed income housing or mixed price housing in their neighborhoods and communities. That I don't believe is borne out by the data. And if anyone would like to, from the panel, would like to offer thoughts about that, let's hear that, and then we'll go to next steps. So.
I'll say two quick things. One is, you're right, Kathy, that there have been a lot of studies on this question, especially about, affordable housing specifically, introduced to a neighborhood, what happens, and in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and all various parts of the country, when the housing, I think, Kerstin, you had mentioned this idea, when the housing is built in an attractive way, which affordable housing can easily be, made in such a way, then there's no substantial negative impact on housing values. So it's a fear that is overblown. I would say, though, in addition to that, we have to remember in the fair housing context that this was the argument used in the 1960s by opponents of efforts to eliminate racial discrimination in housing. They said, well, if there are more Black people who live in this neighborhood, that could decrease my property values. And as a society, we recognized that to inhibit the freedom of Black people based on this fear of declining property values was wrong. That's not a trade-off we're willing to make. And I think that we need to begin to talk about whether that same principle ought to apply to people of modest means. So the first answer is empirically, there's not a lot, no good evidence that this will have a substantial impact on property values. But secondly, that's not the only way to view this question. We have to look at how we're treating people in broad brush based on income, and see that type of discrimination is wrong.
So
And I
stand on that too. Sorry.
Kerstin?
Okay.
Sorry, Kerstin, were you going to say you were?
I was going to say something too, yeah, and then I saw Carlie hopping on as
But
well.
go ahead.
I was just going to respond to both what Carlie and Rick had said and the comment I made earlier about creating attractive community. I think if anything else, if it's done correctly, then residents should be afraid of paying more property taxes than their property values going down, because it's going to go the other direction. And they should also be afraid that now they get more amenities. All of a sudden, they will get trails and access to bikeways and green space, and they will get more restaurants and coffee shops nearby and retail, because density, and I think Matt, you mentioned it earlier, unfortunately still has a negative connotation, but it's really what brings these vibrant urban communities together. And so in my mind, being afraid of property values going down or safety concerns, unless the developer is really proposing a terrible project, which I hardly see in our community here, it's going to be quite the opposite.
Okay, thank you, Kerstin. And just real quickly, I'd like to get a word or two from Matt about that, since he works in the real estate arena. Matt, do you see what our other panelists have been saying about mixed income and mixed use adding to property values rather than decreasing property values?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should point out, I don't do much residential real estate, so I can't comment on, suburban neighborhoods. But as far as all of the commercial areas where there's been mixed use and density, all of those property values are skyrocketing. So, I personally don't think it has a negative impact, but I don't have the data to back it up.
Okay, great. Well, we'll use the data points from our other panelists on that then too. Okay, and then Carlie, you wanted to make a comment about the property values?
Well, I just want to continue what Richard was saying, right? If somebody is saying, if people of color, if people of low income move into your community, your property value is going to go down. And all of the research points to that not being true. I think it is inherent on us to ask, why would somebody tell me that? And if you use mid-century integration as a model, that happened. People came in and said, oh no, Black folks are coming, your property values are going to go down. They were blockbusting. They did that on purpose. They spread those myths on purpose so they could artificially undervalue the market. They could buy it dirt cheap, and then they could flip it for a profit. I mean, it was market manipulation 101.
Great.
I think the lesson we should learn is, if somebody is telling you something that runs counter to the facts and counter to all the evidence, really question why. Is it based in misinformation, or is it based in something different?
Okay, great. That's a really good point. So the main answer is people who believe that just need better information, and now you all are equipped to provide that better information, and this was a great comment. So I'd like now to move on to asking each of our panelists their recommendations for next steps for our region, either for, and you can choose how you'd like to do that, but how do we get to more inclusive housing throughout our region so all our communities have inclusive housing that are inclusive of racial, ethnic, and economic diversity? And how do we no longer be the second most economically segregated community in the country? How do we change this? So who would like to start? Your recommendations for next steps from our amazing panel here.
I'm happy to chime in. One of the things that I see as an issue in Worthington is there's not a voice for the unrepresented groups. And I constantly hear, us catering to the constituents that are in Worthington, and we're not thinking about the folks that are outside of Worthington. And I bring it up a lot with our school district. Our school district is made up of only 25% of people that live in the city proper, and 75% live from without or outside the city boundaries. And I'm constantly trying to, and Building Worthington's Future is trying to advocate for the greater Worthington area that don't have that can't vote in the elections, and can't chime in on different developments. I think, and then the other thing is for example, Morpsey puts out such great statistics and is such a great advocate for our region. I get the sense a lot of times all they can do is lead the horse to water, but then the cities have to take on the responsibility of doing what, taking on the responsibility of what the data shows, and what we need as a community. And I think that more organizations, nonprofit organizations, community organizations, and maybe even the local media need to put more pressure on the different suburbs to actually be more accountable and to actually take action rather than just talking about taking action.
Great, thank you, Matt. Others from our panel, next steps for everyone to take away, what they can do to make our region more inclusive throughout the region?
So I'll go, and I'll say that from my perspective, we can't lose the moment that we're in, that the context of today and coming out of the pandemic is really important. In our county and all of our cities just got an unprecedented, once in a generation influx of hyper flexible dollars that they can spend on just about anything they want. If we commit 30% of those dollars to affordable housing initiatives, things like Move to Prosper, things like zoning reform and the affordability that we can build out of it, things like leveraging the tax credit program, a whole variety of things. If we put 30% of those dollars, the same amount that we ask our families to put towards their housing costs every month, to this, we will have the swiftest, most equitable recovery in history. It will be inclusive, it'll be powerful, it'll set Columbus apart from all of our peers.
Great, thank you, Carlie. A challenge. James, suggestions, next steps for our audience?
Right. So I think Matt said it best. I think the nonprofit, locally grown grassroots organizations play a big part because we're closer to the action, if you will. And, we're talking to our neighbors, right? We're talking about people that live on our street that we talking about engaging in a conversation with them we're not happy for, that might be uncomfortable, but it's very important. But I think Kerstin said it best. I think it was Kerstin said it best earlier, that people tend to trust or listen to people that they know. They tend to trust people that they know. And so I think it's the success stories, like, for example, I'm actually a success story. My mother was a single mother, had a difficult time, finding affordable housing when we were growing up. But my sister and I both, sister's a college professor. I have 2 degrees, beautiful family, all of that thing. So, but I mean, it's so the success stories need to be heard. I think also the facts around property values and to kind of counter the NIMBYism that's not only in your head, but it's also in your heart. I think we need to talk about that as well. And then I think the third piece is connecting that to what people in the Westerville community actually care about. All right. And for many of them, it is community, it's preserving some stuff, but also it's the future. And I think Carlie said something that was really, really, really key, is that doing nothing means that future generation, they move away. They just leave. Like, oh, this is not an inclusive place, that I can't afford to live here. I don't feel included here. It's not a place where those of different backgrounds are welcome. So doing nothing is to our detriment. So I think as we're already planning to do, as WeRISE already planning to do, is to facilitate some of that conversation just as a neighbor to neighbor conversation, where we get that stuff out in the open, because you just can't assume that people know, for example, like with economic segregation is, I don't think people really understand what that means. They may understand, with ethnic and racial segregation is, but economic, maybe not so much. But we talk about those things through perhaps a series of conversations, and then it bubbles up from the ground up, if you will, where residents themselves will say, hey, we've got to do something about including those who are, for example, for us, the Westerville School District, which includes Frank County, parts of Columbus and things, we got to reach out to them and welcome them and their ideas and let them know, hey, we do actually want you to be a part of our community. You are important to us, and we want to be a model, even for the nation, if you will, on how inclusiveness can work, from affordable housing to education and everything else that matters to us.
Thank you, James. Amazing. I want to give Rick a minute here to add his next steps suggestions, and then we're going to wrap up this amazing afternoon. Oh, I'm sorry. Kerstin. Well, Rick and then Kerstin, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. First of all, I agree with Carlie's novel framing of 30% of the money. I love that, going towards increasing affordability. That's a wonderful concept. 4 things: reduce exclusionary zoning. They've done it in California. They've done it in Oregon. They've done it in Minneapolis. They've done it in Charlotte. It can be done here. Second, address source of income discrimination. 19 states in the District of Columbia have laws that say if you're using a housing voucher, you can't discriminate, just as a landlord can't discriminate based on race. That ought to be part of what happens here. Third is inclusionary zoning, which lots of communities have, and so when you have luxury developments going up in luxury apartments in Columbus, make sure that a certain percentage of those are affordable so that you don't have widespread displacement. And then finally, I'll just circle back to support Move to Prosper. I hope that this is such an innovative program. I hope that the government will provide its support for this private effort in kind of a nice public-private partnership, because it's based on research, and I've seen the evidence that it's having a really positive impact on people's lives.
Great, thank you. All right, we are very close to the end here. I'm going to do a quick wrap up. I learned so much, and mostly what I've learned here is that all of you in the audience need to take a note from Matt and James and their organizations and encourage your local officials to change the framework that the communities can work within to create more housing and to create economically and racially integrated housing. And I'm hearing that there's money out there that you can advocate. Start writing to your county commissioners about the recovery dollars and getting a nice part of that to go towards making housing more affordable. And there are a lot of techniques that were mentioned. And then I want to close by thanking our sponsors. There's on the screen here. I want to thank Rick and this amazing panel. We are going to have another panel to finish the conversation another time or to advance it. I want to thank the audience for your attention. And I want to just close by saying you can learn more and get involved by contacting Move to Prosper. That information's in the chat box. And I want to thank Move to Prosper for arranging for this amazing panel to happen this afternoon, along with all the other conversations that we've had today. The beginning of an initiative for building inclusive communities that we will be continuing to hold over the next year. Thank you all.